The sun was sinking low over the dusty plains, painting the horizon with streaks of gold and blood red, and the wind carried the bitter scent of smoke and sagebrush. Out in the open, where the land stretched like an endless sea of sand and rock, a lone cowboy guided his weary horse along the rugged trail. His hat was pulled low over his eyes, and the brim cast a shadow over a face hardened by years under the relentless sun. He moved with a quiet certainty, the kind that came from knowing the land could kill as easily as it could sustain life. Out here, a man had to be sharp, fast, and willing to make choices no one else would dare. He had ridden for days without seeing another soul, the silence around him broken only by the creak of leather and the faint jingle of spurs. Yet despite the isolation, he carried with him a sense of purpose, though it was not the kind born of heroism or honor. No, this purpose was darker, a gamble he'd made at the crossroads of desperation and opportunity. In his pocket lay a promise of payment, the kind of payment that wasn't measured in gold or silver, but in a life tied to another's fate. And it was a payment he never fully understood until the wind whispered secrets across the plains. The town he had left behind had been little more than a rough collection of wooden buildings, the kind that seemed to tremble under the weight of lawlessness and sin. Saloon doors swung with every gust, spilling laughter, smoke, and the occasional fight onto the dirt streets. Outlaws, traders, and drifters came and went like shadows, leaving behind debts and whispers that would last longer than their stay. It was here, in the clatter of cards and gunfire, that the cowboy's path had crossed with a desperate man who owed more than he could ever hope to pay. The man had been cornered, beaten by circumstance and the greed of others, and in his trembling voice, he offered what he had. Not gold, not cattle, not even the promise of work. He offered a girl, an Apache girl, whose fate was suddenly bound to the cowboy's own. The offer hung in the air like a curse, a test of morality and survival. And the cowboy had accepted without fully realizing the consequences. The girl had been quiet when handed over, her dark eyes steady, her hands folded in calm resignation. There had been no protest, only a measured grace that made the cowboy's gut tighten with unease. Something about her felt different, but he dismissed it with a shrug. Payment was payment, and the plains showed no mercy for hesitation. Her presence unsettled the cowboy from the moment they rode together. She didn't speak unless spoken to, and when she did, her words carried weight, as though each syllable had been chosen with the care of a storyteller shaping a legend. She observed the land with an intimacy that suggested it had been hers long before he ever rode into view. She knew the paths, the hidden dangers, the whisper of predators in the tall grass. And every time she warned him with a quiet word or a nod, he realized she had survived more than he could imagine. Yet still, he held his pride tightly, refusing to acknowledge the shadow of curiosity that crept into his mind. He had made a deal, and deals were not undone by suspicion or gut feeling. The nights were the hardest. The fire's glow flickered against the dark shapes of desert hills, the sounds of the wild whispered secrets of things that could not be named. Coyotes called to each other in the distance. The wind carried the rattling of bones. The stars seemed endless, cold, and distant. Sitting by the fire, the cowboy would glance at the girl, wondering who she truly was, sensing a history too rich and complicated for the words she offered. Yet he spoke little. The frontier taught silence as much as it taught survival, and sometimes it was better to wait and watch than to act. But even in silence, unease grew. There were hints, small and subtle, that she was no ordinary girl. When they reached a trading post, she held herself in a way that made merchants and drifters pause, respect or fear flickering in their eyes. When men with rough hands tried to leer or take liberties, she didn't flinch. Her stare could make a man falter, as if the weight of her people pressed down on him. And when she spoke of the land, it was as though she commanded a knowledge that belonged to centuries, not years. The cowboy began to sense that the price he had accepted might not be as simple as he had believed. They rode into canyons that cut deep like wounds into the earth, the shadows stretching long and sinister. It was here that the cowboy first noticed the way her eyes would track movement in the distance, the way she spoke to the wind and the land with a reverence that suggested more than survival. And then came the day when the unmistakable signs appeared, symbols etched into the rocks, ceremonial markings that spoke of heritage, of power, of leadership. And in that moment, a cold realization struck him. This girl, the payment he had claimed without a second thought, might not be just anyone's child. She might be the daughter of a chief, keeper of traditions and authority that he could neither control nor imagine crossing. He tried to ignore it, dismiss it as imagination, but every glance, every gesture from her seemed to confirm the suspicion gnawing at the edge of his mind. She carried herself with a dignity that could not be taught, a strength that did not need to be proved, and a fire in her eyes that mirrored the stubborn sun above. The thought of what might happen if her people learned she had been taken and by him pressed down on him like a boulder ready to crush. And yet he had no way to undo the deal, no gold to return, no power to protect himself from what was coming. The plains did not forgive ignorance. They did not tolerate mistakes. As they set up camp near a river, the girl finally spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "You do not understand the land you walk," she said, her eyes locked on his, "or the people you touch. One wrong step, and it will not be only you who suffers." There was no anger in her tone, only warning, and the cowboy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. He knew then that he had stepped into a world far larger than he had imagined, a world where one miscalculation could summon vengeance, and where the life he thought he controlled was already slipping beyond his grasp. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the darkness, and for a moment, the silence between them carried a weight heavier than words. The wind shifted, carrying the faint, almost imperceptible sound of drums from far away, a rhythm that spoke of ancestry and warning. And as he sat there, staring into the flames, he realized that the journey he thought would be simple, the payment he thought he had claimed with certainty, was only the beginning. He had crossed a line, one that could awaken the wrath of a people and the power of a chief. And the girl, quiet yet unyielding, watched him with the calm awareness of someone who knew the storm that was coming, and that he was standing right in the middle of it. In that moment, the cowboy understood that the land, the people, and the choices he had made were all threads in a web far older than him. He had taken a girl as payment, but he had taken far more than that. He had tangled himself in the legacy of a chief, in a story he had no map for, and in a danger that waited like a shadow beneath the sun. The night deepened, and somewhere in the distance, the echo of horns and chants began to rise, faint but unmistakable, hinting that the past was waking, and that the future could not be bought with gold or recklessness. The girl shifted beside him, and he met her gaze once more, sensing that she knew exactly what he had realized. The cliff of consequence stretched wide and steep before them, and the first steps toward it had already been taken. He knew the ride ahead would be dangerous, that every choice might cost more than he could bear, but he had no choice now. The plains had claimed him, and the story of the cowboy who took an Apache girl as payment was only beginning. And as the stars flickered above the desert, he felt the weight of the coming storm, knowing that once it broke, nothing would ever be the same again. The wind whispered across the canyon, carrying a warning he could not ignore, and the firelight danced on her face, illuminating a resolve that made him shiver. She was no ordinary girl, and he was no ordinary cowboy. The dance of fate had begun, and the question remained, could he survive it? Or had he already ridden straight into a destiny that would consume them both? The night stretched on, long and heavy as the fire sputtered and the wind carried distant murmurs from the canyon. The cowboy sat on a flat rock, chewing the end of a piece of leather, like he was trying to taste a memory. He couldn't shake the feeling that the land itself was watching, that every ridge and shadow held eyes and ears he couldn't see. The girl sat a few paces away, her knees drawn close, her gaze following the flicker of firelight. There was a rhythm to her presence, steady and unyielding, as if she had learned to move with the world rather than against it. He realized he had underestimated her, and that thought made his jaw tighten. He tried to recall the moment he had first met her, the moment the debt had been settled. It had been in a dingy room at the edge of town, where the air smelled of whiskey, sweat, and desperation. The man who owed him had trembled, and when he offered the girl, it had been with a look of surrender, a quiet understanding that his debts were far bigger than any gold could repay. The cowboy had taken her without ceremony, guided by a mix of pragmatism and instinct. She had not cried. She had not begged. She had simply followed, calm and composed. Her presence an unspoken question he did not yet know how to answer. As the fire crackled, he remembered the way her eyes had first met his, dark and steady, unflinching. There was intelligence there, awareness, and a depth that seemed almost untouchable. He had spent that first ride thinking her quietness was fear, perhaps distrust, but now he was beginning to understand that it was far more than that. She had a history he could not imagine, a life intertwined with the land and the people who had raised her. And that history, whatever it was, carried weight. A weight he felt pressing down on him. Invisible but unrelenting, the wind shifted suddenly, carrying the scent of sage and smoke. It was not the scent of a campfire, but something wilder, something deliberate. The cowboy's hand moved to the gun at his side, his instincts screaming that they were not alone. He scanned the dark hills, but the shadows seemed empty. And yet, he felt it's an unspoken presence, the awareness of a people who did not need to be seen to be felt. The girl noticed too. She rose slowly, her movements smooth, almost like a shadow blending with the darkness. She spoke in a low voice, a whisper that somehow carried authority. "They are near. Watch the wind and listen. They will not come openly, but they will know we are here." The cowboy's pulse quickened. He had faced dangers before: bandits, storms, wild animals, but this felt different. This was not about survival in the usual sense. This was about trespassing into a world he barely understood, one tied to loyalty, bloodlines, and power. He tried to meet her gaze, to ask questions with his eyes. But she was already scanning the terrain, her expression unreadable, almost ceremonial. He realized then that she carried more than skill. She carried knowledge of rules he had never been taught, rules that governed a society older than any town he had passed through. As the hours passed, the cowboy tried to piece together the fragments of what he knew. The girl had spoken once about her people in vague terms, mentioning the importance of the land, of tradition, and of the chief. But her words were measured, almost cryptic, and each time he asked for more, she would give nothing. Only a hint or a look that told him to wait. He had never been patient, but something about her demanded it. He began to sense that the deeper he pressed, the more dangerous it could become, not just for him, but for her. And in that danger there was truth. The girl's story, when it came, was never linear. She spoke of the village she had grown up in, a place hidden among canyons and riverbeds, a settlement that thrived because it respected the land and the seasons. Her people were fierce, protective, and bound by laws older than any written word. She spoke of the chief, her father. Though she had not said the word outright with reverence and fear, she hinted at the consequences that awaited anyone who harmed or misused what belonged to their people. The cowboy listened, trying to reconcile the girl he had seen as quiet and obedient with the presence she described, a presence that could command respect and fear in equal measure. As the moon rose, pale and watchful, the cowboy began to piece together the danger he had stepped into. If her people discovered that she had been taken Evan, if it was by agreement, they would not see him as anything less than a threat. And yet, he could not simply return her to the man who had offered her. That man had no control, no standing to protect her or himself. The cowboy realized that he was caught in a web of choices, and each one carried risk. The land had shifted beneath his feet, and he was no longer merely a traveler. He was part of a story much larger than him, a story that could turn deadly at the first misstep. The next morning, the girl led him along hidden paths, through rock formations and arroyos, teaching him without words. He began to see the land through her eyes, understanding how every ridge, every shadow, and every scent could carry meaning. It was exhausting, humbling, and exhilarating. And through it, he began to notice the small hints of danger, broken branches that suggested recent passage, the distant echo of hooves and signs of eyes watching from places he would never have thought to look. He realized that the world he had taken for granted, the open plains, the freedom of the road, was far more treacherous than he had imagined. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words cut sharper than any blade. "Do not assume the land belongs to anyone," she said once, her gaze piercing. "It belongs to those who know it, and to those who respect it. Every step you take is witnessed, and every action has consequence." The cowboy nodded, unsure if he fully understood, but aware that there was wisdom there he could not ignore. He began to feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, the kind of weight that gold or skill could never balance. Days passed, and their journey continued, each mile revealing both beauty and danger. Rivers carved through canyons like veins of silver, and the sun set in a blaze of color that made the plains seem almost holy. Yet beneath the beauty, he felt constant tension. Every movement, every sound, could be a warning. And always there was the girl, silent when necessary, commanding when needed, a guide and a mystery at the same time. He began to understand that her calm was not submission but strength. She had survived in a world that demanded more than courage. She had survived by knowing when to act and when to wait. One evening, as they camped near a cliff edge overlooking a valley, she finally revealed more of her story. Her voice was quiet, but each word held weight. She spoke of her father's leadership, challenges he faced in keeping peace among their people, and the dangers from outsiders who sought to exploit the land. She did not speak of herself directly, but the cowboy could see it in her posture, in the way she carried herself. She was not just a daughter. She was a reflection of everything her father stood for. Anyone who crossed her or harmed her would face the full force of that legacy. The cowboy felt a mix of awe and fear. He had thought he understood risk, but nothing had prepared him for this. He had taken her as payment, yet he now realized he had stepped into a story that could consume him. He could not turn back, not entirely, and yet moving forward was dangerous in ways he could barely imagine. The tension between them was not spoken, but it was palpable. A quiet understanding that they were bound together by circumstance and choice, yet separated by forces neither could control. That night, the wind carried strange sounds from the valley below, rhythmic and deliberate. The cowboy's hand hovered over his gun, muscles tense, while the girl remained calm, her eyes reflecting the firelight. She did not speak, but her expression warned him that what lay ahead was far more serious than any outlaw or storm he had faced before. The presence in the valley was not accidental. It was a message, a warning, possibly the beginning of a reckoning he could not avoid. As they settled in for the night, the cowboy stared into the darkness, trying to make sense of what he had agreed to, what he had taken, and what was coming. He realized that every step he had taken, every choice he had made, had led him here, to a moment where the past, the land, and the people's power intersected. And the girl, sitting beside him, seemed to embody that intersection, a living link to forces he did not understand but could no longer ignore. He felt the weight of the cliff before him. Not a literal drop, but the precipice of consequences and dangers that would not wait. The story was unfolding around him, faster and sharper than he could predict. And every shadow in the canyon seemed alive with intent. He knew the next moves would be critical, yet he had no map, no guide but the girl beside him. She had the knowledge, the instinct, and the heritage that could protect them both, doom them both, depending on how the next moments played out. And as the firelight flickered across the canyon walls, casting long, uneasy shadows, the cowboy understood something he could not yet say aloud. He had thought he was taking a girl as payment, but in truth, he had become part of something far larger, a story of power, loyalty, and danger that had existed long before him, and that would outlast him if he was not careful. The plains held their breath, the night held its secrets, and somewhere beyond the cliffs, the rhythm of drums and voices began to rise again, carrying a warning, a message, and a storm that was only just beginning. The first light of dawn barely touched the canyon walls when the cowboy woke to the girl already standing, her silhouette outlined against the rising sun. She had moved silently, almost like the land itself had carried her there. And he realized she had been awake long before he had stirred. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the distant ridges. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but carried the weight of warning. "They are coming," she said. "Not all of them, but enough to test us." The cowboy rubbed his eyes and tried to gauge what she meant. He had expected danger, always expected it out here, but the certainty in her tone made the hairs on his neck rise. He glanced toward the valley below, where the first hints of movement could be seen if one knew what to look for: subtle ripples of dust, shadows shifting against the rocks, and a faint glint that suggested metal. Bandits? Scouts? Or perhaps something else entirely? Something tied to the people she had spoken of, the chief, and the legacy he had so foolishly entangled himself in. They packed their few belongings and began the descent. Moving carefully over narrow ledges and across loose stone, the girl led without hesitation, her knowledge of the terrain flawless. The cowboy followed, trying to match her pace and quiet, aware that any mistake could draw attention. His mind raced with questions. Who exactly were they tracking them? Was this a warning from her people, or had the man who had sold her taken action from behind the scenes? And if it was her people, how would they react when they discovered what had happened? He had no answers, only the gnawing sense that he had stepped into a story that had been written long before he arrived. The morning air was sharp with cold, but the heat of tension pressed heavier on him. As they moved, the cowboy began to notice other signs: carefully placed stones, footprints that seemed deliberate, and small fires burning in the distance, likely set to mark paths or signal others. The girl spoke rarely, but each instruction she gave was precise and deliberate. She warned him to step lightly, to watch for movement above as well as below, and to trust the land even when instinct screamed otherwise. He tried, but every nerve in his body thrummed with anxiety. He realized the danger was no longer hypothetical. It was tangible and moving with purpose toward them. By midday, the valley opened into a wide expanse, dotted with scrub and mesquite. The cowboy noticed that the movement in the distance had increased. Figures appeared on ridges and among the rocks, some barely visible, others clearly mounted on horses. They were watching, waiting. The girl paused and knelt by a small outcropping, tracing symbols into the dirt with her fingers, muttering under her breath. The cowboy bent closer, trying to make sense of the shapes. They seemed ceremonial, protective, like a warning or perhaps a call for help. He understood that these markings were part of her heritage, part of the culture he had brushed past in his ignorance. Suddenly the wind shifted again, and with it came the sound of hooves striking stone, soft but purposeful. The cowboy's hand went to his gun, and he motioned for the girl to remain still. She did not flinch. Instead, she crouched lower, whispering a single word he did not understand. The figures on the ridge paused, as though sensing something in the air, then melted back into the rocks, leaving only the faintest traces of movement. The cowboy exhaled slowly, realizing the subtlety of the danger. They were being watched, tested, and judged. Every step forward was a negotiation, a gamble, and he had no experience with the rules that governed this land. As they pressed on, the cowboy found himself thinking of the man who had offered her his payment. The desperation in that man's eyes now seemed almost insignificant compared to the storm gathering around them. He wondered if the man even realized the consequences of what he had done, the ripple effect that had thrown the girl into a world of threats, loyalties and power far beyond her or the cowboy's control. The thought unsettled him further. He had become part of a story that was both older and larger than he could comprehend. And every moment he lingered in ignorance brought new peril. By late afternoon, the landscape changed, giving way to a series of cliffs and narrow gorges. The girl led him into a hidden passage that wound between jagged rocks, and the cowboy marveled at how icily she navigated. She moved with a confidence born of familiarity, her every step calculated and deliberate. As they walked, she spoke quietly about her people, revealing fragments of history and tradition. She told him about the ways the chief maintained peace, the stories of betrayal and honor that shaped their world, and the importance of balance between outsiders and those who had lived on the land for generations. Each word deepened the cowboy's understanding, but also reminded him how precarious their situation had become. The sound of water in the distance led them to a small creek. where the girl paused to wash her hands and face. The cowboy followed, using the moment to catch his breath and to think. He realized that while he had assumed control when he accepted the girl, in truth, she had always held it. Her calmness, knowledge, and instinct made it clear that any attempt to assert authority would be futile. And yet he sensed that she was not fully open with him, that there were truths she could not reveal, secrets that carried the weight of generations. He understood finally that survival in this land required more than firepower or grit. It required understanding, respect, the ability to see threats before they became unavoidable. As they rested, the distant sound of drums carried through the canyon. The rhythm was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it grew clearer, steady, deliberate. The girl's expression tightened, her eyes narrowing. "They are near," she said again, her voice low. "They move with purpose. Not all come to greet. Some come to judge. Some come to fight." The cowboy felt a chill run down his spine. This was not just a warning, it was a prelude, a test of endurance, loyalty, and perhaps even morality. And he realized that he had no idea which category he fell into. Hours passed in tense silence. Every sound, every shift of light, every whisper of wind became a signal to be interpreted. The cowboy learned to watch for subtle signs, the way the birds moved, the rustle of leaves, the shadow cast by rocks. And always, the girl was a step ahead, reading the land and its hidden language with a skill he could only admire. He began to understand the depth of her connection, the way her heritage had shaped her into someone who could survive, even thrive where others would falter. Night fell again, deeper and darker than before, and the figures in the distance had grown more numerous. The girl led them to a hidden alcove, a natural shelter carved into the cliff face. She lit a small fire, careful to keep it low, and motioned for him to sit. "They are close enough to see the smoke," she said softly. "If they choose, they will come. And if they do, we must be ready, not with force alone, but with understanding." The cowboy nodded, though he had no idea what understanding would accomplish in a confrontation that could easily turn deadly. He had only learned one thing for certain. He had underestimated the cost of his choice as they waited. The girl spoke of her father again, describing the weight of leadership, the burdens of loyalty, and the unforgiving nature of their enemies. She spoke in stories rather than facts, and the cowboy listened, recognizing that within the narratives were warnings, strategies, and insights into the culture he had stumbled into. He realized that she had been trained all her life to read people, to anticipate moves, and to survive. And he also realized that every day he had taken her as payment. He had risked more than he knew: his life, his honor, and perhaps even the lives of those who could be caught in the crossfire. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint smell of smoke and dust. Figures appeared in the moonlight, moving slowly and deliberately toward their hiding place. The cowboy's pulse quickened. He reached for his gun, but the girl shook her head, her expression steady. "Wait," she said. "Observe first. Speak second. Act only when necessary." He obeyed, though every instinct screamed otherwise. The people in the valley below were not ordinary travelers or bandits. They moved with purpose, precision, and an understanding of the land that rivaled even hers. He realized they could be scouts, protectors, or even spies, messengers of power he could not yet comprehend. Hours passed, and the tension in the air was nearly unbearable. The cowboy's mind raced, trying to anticipate what would happen, how to react, and what the girl's plans might be. He knew that the situation could spiral into violence at any moment, and yet he also knew that rash action could destroy any chance of survival. The girl remained calm, her eyes fixed on the approaching figures, her posture a combination of readiness and restraint. He began to understand that the real conflict was not just between him and these people, but within the balance of knowledge, respect, and strategy. As the first figure emerged from the shadows of the valley and climbed toward them, the cowboy realized that the story he had entered when he took the girl as payment was far from simple. It was a story of legacy, loyalty, and unseen power. And he was now a character with no clear role, no map, and no certainty of survival. The girl beside him was his only guide, yet even she carried mysteries he could not unravel. The tension was palpable, the stakes unimaginable, the plains around them silent witnesses to the drama that was unfolding. He had come seeking payment, thinking only of obligation and survival. But the land, the girl, and the people watching from below had other plans. The storm was gathering, and the first drops had begun to fall, unseen but imminent, promising a reckoning he could not yet imagine. The cowboy's hand rested on the gun, but his mind understood something deeper. The fight ahead would require more than skill with a weapon. It would demand understanding, courage, and perhaps a willingness to face consequences far greater than he had ever known. The girl turned slightly, her eyes meeting his with a calm intensity that both comforted and unnerved him. "They know we are here," she said softly, "and they will not leave without testing us. Remember, the land is patient, but the people are not." The cowboy nodded, feeling the weight of her words press down on him. The valley below seemed to breathe, alive with unseen watchers and hidden intentions. The conflict had begun, though the first blow had yet to fall. And the cowboy realized that every choice from this moment forward could decide not only his fate, but hers, and perhaps even the legacy of the people whose power he had stumbled into. The night deepened. The figures continued to move, and the fire flickered, casting long shadows across the rock walls. The plains held their breath, and the cowboy knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same. And as the girl rose, her movements fluid and deliberate. He felt the pulse of history and danger intertwining, carrying them toward a confrontation that would test everything they knew, everything they were, and everything they hoped to survive. The night grew heavier, the canyon shadows deepening as the wind shifted once more. The cowboy and the girl crouched in their alcove, barely breathing, every sense straining to catch movement below. The figures in the valley were no longer distant shapes. They moved with deliberate intent, their forms now clear in the moonlight, horses and riders silent as predators on the hunt. The cowboy felt his heart hammer against his ribs. Every instinct screamed to act, to draw his gun and confront them, but the girl's calm, unyielding presence kept him frozen. She had warned him, patience first. Action only when necessary. The sound of the wind through the rocks carried another message, something subtle. A shift in the cadence of hooves, the brush of leaves where there should have been silence. He realized they were being circled, watched not just from the front, but from the ridges above and behind. His mind raced, trying to calculate every possible outcome, every move that could save them. And yet, he could see that the girl was already ahead of him in thought, reading patterns he could not even detect. She whispered his name and pointed toward a narrow ledge hidden in shadow. "We move now," she said, "or we risk being trapped." They scrambled along the cliff edge, the loose rock threatening to betray them at every step. The cowboy's boots slipped more than once, and each time the girl steadied him with a hand, her grip firm and unwavering. His thoughts flickered to the choices that had led them here, choices made in desperation, in debt, and in ignorance. He had taken her as payment, and now the weight of that decision pressed down like the stones beneath their feet. He knew the danger was no longer just about survival. It was about respect, legacy, and the wrath of a people who could move like shadows and strike like lightning as they rounded a bend. The valley opened below to reveal a camp, faint fires flickering among the rocks. The figures were organized now, not wandering or searching, but waiting, a silent force of scrutiny and intention. The girl froze and gestured for him to stay back. Her eyes swept the scene, noting the positions of every rider, every scout, every hidden watcher. "They test us," she murmured. "Not all will come forward, but all watch. Every choice we make is visible to them." The cowboy swallowed hard. He had faced outlaws and gunmen, storms and starvation, but nothing had ever felt like this. This was not just danger, this was judgment. Hours passed in tense silence as they observed the camp. The cowboy's fingers ached from gripping his gun, yet he dared not move. The girl's movements were minimal, deliberate, a series of small gestures that seemed to communicate with unseen allies. He realized she was not merely waiting, she was negotiating in a language he did not understand, a language of respect, power, and ancestral knowledge. The realization unsettled him further. He had thought he understood control. Now he understood how little control he truly had. Night deepened further, and a new sound cut through the canyon, a low, resonant chant, the rhythm of drums echoing off the cliffs. The cowboy's blood ran cold. He had heard the distant drums before, but now they were close, deliberate, and growing stronger. The girl's expression hardened. "They are here," she said. "The others have joined them." They moved to surround. "We cannot stay where we are." Her calmness belied the tension in the air, and he felt it like a living thing pressing down. Heavy and relentless, they began to move again, slipping through hidden paths and narrow ravines, the moonlight casting eerie shapes across the canyon floor. The cowboy's eyes darted in every direction, trying to anticipate danger, but every shadow seemed alive. He realized that every step they took, every miscalculation, could expose them. He glanced at the girl, whose eyes were fixed ahead, unwavering. She carried a confidence born not of recklessness, but of experience, of knowledge passed down through generations. He understood then that she was not simply surviving. She was guiding him through a maze he had no map for. A sudden noise to the left, a branch snapping, almost imperceptible, made him freeze. The girl immediately pressed him into shadow, her hand on his shoulder, her eyes scanning the ridge above. Two figures emerged, moving cautiously, clearly scouts from the camp below. The cowboy's fingers twitched toward his gun, but the girl shook her head. "Let them pass," she whispered. "They are testing. Aggression now would bring disaster." He nodded, holding his breath as the scouts passed, oblivious to their presence. The tension in his chest eased slightly, but only slightly. He knew this was just the beginning, the calm before a storm that had been building for hours. By midnight, they reached a narrow canyon that cut through the cliffs like a knife. The girl paused, placing a hand on the rock wall. She traced symbols into the stone, more intricate than any he had seen before. "This is a marker," she said softly. "It shows the path to safety, but also warns those who would follow. If they choose wrong, the consequences will be theirs." The cowboy watched, fascinated and uneasy. He had thought he understood danger in simple terms: gunfights, outlaws, storms, but this was different. This was danger woven into the land, into the history, into the legacy of a people whose power he had underestimated. As they moved deeper into the canyon, the sounds of the camp below grew distant, replaced by the low hum of the night and the distant roar of wind through rock formations. Yet the tension remained thick and almost tangible. Every movement, every whisper, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified. The cowboy realized that they were not just avoiding detection, they were engaged in a delicate dance with a power he could not comprehend. And the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. If they misstepped, it would not just be his life at risk, but hers, and possibly the fragile balance between outsiders and the people who had claimed these lands for generations. The girl finally stopped, her gaze fixed on a ledge above. She gestured for him to follow and began climbing, her movements fluid and precise. The cowboy followed, sweat stinging his eyes, muscles burning from the exertion and tension. As he reached the top, he saw what she had seen: a small plateau that overlooked the valley and the camp below. From this vantage, they could see everything: the patterns of movement, distribution of people, the faint flicker of signal fires. It was a perfect observation point, and yet the cowboy felt a cold unease. They were exposed, and any misstep could reveal their position to a group far more skilled than he had anticipated. Hours passed in silence as they watched. The cowboy tried to learn from her, noting how she read subtle shifts in the wind, how she interpreted shadows, how she understood the language of movement among people and animals alike. He realized he had been blind to this world. Assuming that survival was only about skill with a gun or the ability to ride, now he understood it was about patience, observation, and respect for powers he could barely begin to fathom. And yet, even with all this understanding, He could not shake the sense that the storm was closing in, that the confrontation they had been avoiding would arrive sooner than he hoped. Suddenly, a flare of fire from the camp caught his attention. The girl's head snapped toward it, eyes narrowing. "They signal," she said, voice barely a whisper. "They are ready. The others are moving. Soon, it will not be observation. Soon, it will be confrontation." The cowboy's chest tightened. He had anticipated danger, but he had hoped to control it somehow, to guide it to a point where he could survive. Now, he realized, survival might depend not on skill, but on his ability to trust her, to follow her lead, and to navigate a world he had only just begun to understand. The figures from the camp began to move, faster, more deliberately, spreading across the valley and ridges in a pattern that suggested strategy and intent. The drums began again, their rhythm faster, urgent, like the beating of a warning heart. The cowboy's mind raced, imagining every possible outcome, every way they could be surrounded, trapped, or ambushed. The girl's hand touched his shoulder, steadying him. "Stay with me," she said. "Do not act unless I tell you. Watch. Wait. Listen." "Then we move together," he nodded, feeling the full weight of the night, the land, and the impending confrontation pressing down on him. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity as they waited on the plateau. The valley below, alive with unseen eyes and silent movement. The cowboy could feel the tension coiling tighter and tighter in his chest, a rope ready to snap. Every sound of wind, every flicker of firelight, every rustle of leaves was a potential threat. And through it all, the girl remained calm, her eyes alert, her body poised for action. He realized that she was not merely preparing for defense, she was preparing for a challenge, a test of skill, wit, encouraged that he might barely survive. As the first light of dawn began to touch the canyon walls, the cowboy realized that the moment of confrontation was imminent. The camp below had shifted into position, the drums echoing like a heartbeat, and the girl turned to him, her eyes dark with resolve. "Soon," she said softly, "they will test us. And when they do, everything changes." The cowboy swallowed, feeling the tension squeeze him like a vice. He had entered this world thinking he could claim a simple payment, and now he stood on the brink of a storm that could consume him, her, and everything he had taken for granted. The valley below seemed to hold its breath, the wind whispering warnings he could not interpret, the shadows thick with hidden watchers. The cowboy gripped his gun, though he knew it might not be enough. The girl's gaze remained fixed on the approaching figures, calm, steady, unyielding. He understood then that the climax was near, not yet arrived, but unavoidable, and that every choice they made in the next moments could determine not only survival, but honor, loyalty, and the fragile balance between outsiders and the people who had lived on these plains far longer than he ever would. The tension was complete. The night had given way to dawn. The valley was alive with unseen forces, and the girl beside him was ready. The cowboy knew that the story he had entered one that began with a simple transaction, a desperate debt, and the taking of a girl was about to erupt into its most dangerous, unpredictable, and intense chapter. The storm of conflict was almost upon them, and all that remained was to wait, watch, and hope they could navigate the coming trial without being destroyed. The first rays of the morning, sun spilled into the canyon, painting the rocks with gold and red. The cowboy and the girl remained on the plateau, watching the camp below, knowing that the moment of reckoning had arrived. The drums had stopped, replaced by silence that was heavier than any noise. Every figure in the valley moved cautiously, aware of their presence, aware that the two on the cliff had eyes that could see too much. The tension was a living thing, curling around the cowboy's chest, tightening with every heartbeat. He felt the weight of the past days, the choices that had brought them here, and the reality that none of this could have been anticipated. The girl shifted beside him, her movements calm and deliberate. She had been quiet all night, her strategy unspoken but clear. He understood now that she had not just been leading him through the land, she had been preparing him, shaping him, teaching him to see, to anticipate, to respect. Her heritage, the strength of her people, and the authority she carried were now fully evident. The cowboy had assumed he was the one with control, but in truth, He had been guided every step of the way by someone who understood consequences, history, and honor far better than he ever could. The figures below began to signal to each other, movements precise, deliberate, and coordinated. The cowboy gripped his gun, though he doubted it would be enough against such organized force. Then he noticed the subtle gestures of the girl, tiny shifts in her posture. A look toward the left ridge, a hand brushing lightly over a carved stone. He realized she was communicating with them, negotiating silently, weaving a delicate balance between challenge and diplomacy. He had no words to describe it, but he felt the invisible thread connecting them. A thread of understanding, respect, an authority that commanded the attention of every figure below. A single rider moved forward, breaking from the shadows and approaching the base of the cliff. The cowboy tensed, but the girl raised a hand, and he froze. The rider stopped, and for a long moment there was only silence. Then the girl spoke, her voice carrying effortlessly down to the valley. "We do not wish harm," she said. "We mean no disrespect. We follow the rules of the land and honor the past." Her tone was calm, steady, yet filled with authority. The rider nodded slightly, a subtle acknowledgement, and signaled to the others. Slowly, carefully, the figures began to withdraw, dispersing into the shadows from which they had come. The cowboy's chest loosened as relief washed over him, though he knew the danger had not fully passed. As the valley emptied, the girl turned to him, her expression unreadable, but her eyes softening slightly. "They understand now," she said. "You have done what few outsiders could. You followed, you observed, and you respected. They will watch, yes, but they will not strike. Not today." The cowboy exhaled, feeling the tension drain from his body. He had survived, but the experience had changed him. He had entered this world thinking he could control it with skill and bravado, but now he understood that true survival required more observation, respect, and humility before forces larger than oneself. They began their descent from the plateau. Moving slowly through the narrow canyon paths, the cowboy noticed the beauty around him, the way the morning sun glinted off the rocks, the delicate curve of the creek below, and the soft rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. He had been so focused on danger, on survival, that he had missed the intricacy of the land, the harmony between people and place, and the depth of culture that had protected these plains for generations. Walking beside the girl, he felt a new appreciation for the world around him, a respect he had never known on the open trails or in the lawless towns he had passed through. As they approached a larger clearing, the girl slowed, her eyes scanning the horizon. "This is where we rest," she said. "For now, the land is safe, but vigilance remains. Respect is earned, not given." The cowboy nodded, realizing that the journey had been as much about learning as it had been about survival. She had tested him, guided him, and forced him to confront not only the danger around them, but the arrogance and assumptions he had carried. In her silence and her wisdom, he had discovered a truth he could not ignore. Power without understanding was nothing, and survival depended on more than strength alone. They settled by a small fire near the creek, the sound of water soothing after the tension of the past days. The cowboy watched the girl, noticing details he had not before: the steady rhythm of her breathing, the calm with which she moved, the way her eyes could see far beyond the immediate. He felt gratitude, respect, and a quiet awe. She had been more than a companion. She had been a teacher, a guide, and a reminder that even in the harshest, most unforgiving places, wisdom and heritage carried weight far beyond that of gun or gold. Hours passed as they rested, the sun climbing higher. The cowboy spoke little, not needing to. The girl shared fragments of her past, small stories of her people, the land, and the chief. He listened, realizing that her history was not just personal, but tied to the very survival of her people. Every story carried lessons of honor, courage, restraint, and foresight. He began to see that the danger he had feared had been as much a lesson as a threat, a way to show him that the world was wider and more complex than he had ever imagined. By afternoon, they reached the edge of a small settlement, partially hidden by rocks and brush. The girl's demeanor shifted subtly, alert but relaxed. "We are close," she said. "This is where my father's influence reaches, where allies await, and where respect is earned through deeds, not words." The cowboy followed, noting the subtle signs of habitation, carved symbols on stones, smoke curling gently from hidden fires, and distant voices that carried authority. He understood that they were approaching not just safety, but recognition, a validation of the choices they had made and the respect they had shown. They entered the settlement cautiously. The people there watched them, curious but unthreatening. The girl moved confidently, nodding to a few elders, her presence commanding attention. The cowboy felt the eyes on him, judging, assessing, and he realized how far he had come from the naive man who had taken her as payment. He had learned to observe, to respect, and to understand, and in doing so, he had earned a measure of acceptance even if silent within a world that had once seemed impossible to navigate. Finally, they reached a central dwelling where the chief himself awaited. The girl spoke softly, introducing him with words he did not fully understand, but could sense carried weight. The chief looked at the cowboy with quiet scrutiny, assessing the man who had claimed the girl as payment and survived the trials of the canyon and valley. The cowboy held his head high, not with bravado, but with honesty, acknowledging the mistakes and the learning that had brought him to this moment. The chief's gaze lingered, weighing experience against character, action against intention, and finally, a slow nod of acknowledgement confirmed what the cowboy had hoped but not dared to expect. Respect had been earned. The girl stepped forward, her eyes meeting her father's, and he saw a moment of pride and relief pass between them. She had returned safely, and the lessons she had imparted had not been wasted. The cowboy felt the weight of gratitude and understanding, realizing that the journey had changed him, reshaped his perception of danger, honor, and human connection. He had entered thinking only of debt and payment, but he was leaving with knowledge, humility, and a sense of responsibility far greater than any sum of gold could convey. Over the next hours, they shared simple meals, listened to stories of the land, and the cowboy finally understood the depth of what had occurred. The people he had feared, the danger that had pressed like a shadow over him, were not merely obstacles. They were keepers of wisdom, guardians of heritage, and teachers of survival in a form he had never known. He reflected on the journey, the choices he had made, the mistakes he had survived, and the truths he had learned. The plains, the canyons, and the people were all part of a living lesson he could never forget as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the settlement. The cowboy and the girl walked to the edge of the cliffs, overlooking the valley they had traversed. He felt a sense of peace, tempered by the knowledge that the land remained unpredictable, that danger could rise again, and that respect must always be maintained. Yet for the first time, he also felt understanding, connection, and a profound sense of humility. He had thought he was taking something from the land and its people, but in truth, he had received far more than he had ever given. The girl looked at him and smiled faintly, a rare gesture that conveyed approval, acknowledgement, and quiet warmth. "You survived," she said simply. "But more than that, you learned. Remember this always." The cowboy nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink deep. He understood now that survival was not only about strength, skill, or courage. It was about respect, observation, humility, and the wisdom to know when to act and when to wait. As night fell over the canyon, the settlement quieted, the firelight flickering against the rocks, and the wind whispered through the cliffs. The cowboy sat beside the girl, looking out at the valley, the land, and the world he had barely begun to understand. He realized that he had been transformed by the journey, by the lessons, and by the presence of a girl he had once thought of as simply a payment. Now, he saw her for what she truly was, a guide, a guardian, a bridge between two worlds he had never imagined connecting. The story of the cowboy and the Apache girl had reached its resolution, but its lessons lingered about respect, courage, heritage, and the bonds formed through trials and understanding. The plains had tested them, the people had judged them, and the legacy of the land had been honored. And as the firelight dimmed and the stars blinked awake above the cliffs, the cowboy felt a sense of completion, tempered by the knowledge that the land, the people, and the lessons would remain with him forever. The debt had been repaid, but the wisdom he carried was priceless. A treasure no one could take, a story no one could erase. Top of form, bottom of form.